The bull had watched it all. The bruises, the silence, the cruelty no one else seemed to notice. But what he did one summer morning would stop a woman in her tracks, save a child, and make an entire town whisper for years to come. The wind carried a dry bitterness through the grasslands outside Marlow, a fading town with too many empty houses and not enough laughter. In one of those homes, tucked between a rusted windmill and a barbed wire fence, lived a girl named Eliza Marin. She was 10 years old, quiet by necessity, and smaller than most her age, with knobby elbows and dirt-stained feet. Her world was a narrow one, consisting mostly of kitchen chores, broken fences, and silence. The kind of silence that settles in when love has long since fled. Her stepmother, Corinne, had moved into the house 2 years prior, bringing with her a sharp tongue, colder eyes, and an unspoken resentment for anything that reminded her of Eliza's mother, especially Eliza. Corinne was not loud in her cruelty. She didn't need to be. Her discipline came in tightly measured moments. A too-hard grip on the arm, withheld meals, icy glares that made Eliza flinch even before words were spoken. Every mistake, no matter how small, was met with punishment. And most days there were mistakes, whether real or imagined. Eliza's father, Nathan, worked the rail line 3 counties over. He left before dawn on Mondays and returned after dark on Fridays, often too tired or distracted to notice what unfolded in his absence. When he did ask how things were at home, Corinne would smile, lay a hand on Eliza's shoulder just a bit too firmly, and say everything was fine. Eliza would nod, because telling the truth had never earned her anything but more hurt. The only presence on the ranch that seemed to care for her at all was a massive speckled bull named Granger. Towering and solid, with dull copper hide and horns like crescent moons, Granger had been her father's pride when he first acquired him. A retired show bull too stubborn for auction and too mean for rodeo. But with Eliza, the bull had always been still, attentive, as if the storms that brewed behind his dark eyes calmed in the girl's presence. Eliza spent her rare free moments by the pen, resting her head against the warped wood, humming the lullabies her mother once sang. Granger would press close, the heat of his breath brushing her face. Sometimes, she spoke to him in whispers, words she dared not voice anywhere else, about the hunger in her belly, the bruises that bloomed like ink stains on her arms, the way Corinne would stare at her for minutes on end, saying nothing, as if trying to erase her with silence. Granger never responded, but he never walked away either. On a Saturday morning in mid-June, the air already heavy with heat, Eliza was scrubbing the kitchen floor when her elbow nudged a glass off the counter. It hit the tile and shattered. The silence that followed was brief, only a moment, before Corinne came storming in from the hallway, her face stiff with fury. What followed wasn't unusual, but it was cruel. A cuff to the back of Eliza's head, followed by orders barked through clenched teeth. She was made to pick up every shard with her bare hands, and when a sliver sliced her finger, Corinne only sneered. Later, while Eliza stood at the sink rinsing the blood from her palm, she heard her stepmother muttering to herself in the living room, words like ungrateful and burden hissing through the heat. That night, when Corinne had gone to bed and the cicadas had begun their rasping chorus outside, Eliza slipped from the house. Her footsteps were soft in the dry grass, and her breath came slow. She crossed the yard toward Granger's enclosure. The bull was awake, standing beneath the lone oak tree in the field, his shape nearly lost in shadow. As Eliza approached, he turned his head. His horns caught the moonlight like blades. She leaned her arms over the top rail of the fence and just stood there, her scraped palms resting on the worn wood. Granger came closer, his hooves stirring the dust. He let out a soft grunt, more like a sigh than a sound of alarm. Eliza didn't speak this time. She simply closed her eyes and stood quietly as Granger pressed his massive head gently against her shoulder. His breathing was slow and steady, and her body seemed to match it naturally. But something had shifted in the bull. For weeks, he'd watched the girl's fear, her injuries, the way she carried herself like someone who expected pain. Animals know pattern, and Granger had recognized one. He'd seen how Eliza's body tensed at Corinne's voice, how she flinched from touch, how she moved too quietly for a child. He'd heard the sharpness in Corinne's tone through the windows, smelled the change in Eliza's scent when she was afraid. Granger didn't think like humans, but he understood danger. 2 days later, Corinne decided the bull was a problem. It started when she noticed Eliza slipping out more and more, lingering near the pen. Then she saw the way Granger watched her from across the field whenever she raised her voice. It unsettled her, even if she couldn't explain why. The idea of the girl having comfort, even in an animal, infuriated her. She mentioned it casually to Nathan that Friday night after dinner, calling the bull agitated. Saying he'd been acting odd lately, Nathan brushed her off. He trusted the bull. And besides, there were more pressing issues at work. Corinne said nothing more that night, but the next morning, she walked to the old tool shed and took down a long, coiled rope, the kind used for controlling unruly livestock. She wasn't strong enough to harm the animal, not directly, but she could tether him, break his sense of authority, teach the girl that even her beast could be made to submit. That was the plan. She waited until Eliza had been sent inside to scrub windows. Then, under the baking sun, she crossed the yard toward Granger's pen. The bull stood on the far side of the field, grazing idly. Corinne opened the gate, the rope looped in one hand, and walked across the field like someone who believed they could not be challenged. Granger lifted his head before she reached him. He watched her with flat, unreadable eyes. When she got close enough to throw the rope, he didn't move. She cast the loop toward his horns. Too confident, too fast, and missed. The rope fell to the ground. Granger took one step forward. Corinne froze. Something about the way he moved didn't feel right. His muscles bunched beneath his skin, his tail flicking once, then twice. His breathing was louder now, heavier. She bent to retrieve the rope. Granger snorted. A deep, vibrating sound that rolled through the field like thunder. Corinne backed away instinctively, her hands trembling. The rope slipped from her fingers. As she turned, intending to retreat, her foot caught in a dry patch of grass and she stumbled to one knee. Granger didn't charge. He didn't need to. Instead, he moved slowly, deliberately, until he was just a few feet away. His body blocked the sun. His hooves thudded softly against the earth. He lowered his massive head until it was level with hers. Corinne looked up, pale and breathless. Then she ran. By the time Corinne reached the house, her breath was ragged and her face streaked with sweat and panic. She didn't tell Eliza what had happened. She didn't even speak. She simply slammed the back door and locked it behind her, as if the bull might somehow follow. For the rest of that day, she didn't go near the field. She avoided the windows facing it. And when Nathan returned home that evening, she said nothing about Granger at all. Eliza, however, noticed the change. She saw how Corinne flinched at distant hoofbeats, how she kept checking over her shoulder. And most importantly, she saw how Granger had positioned himself near the front of the pasture, always between the house and the girl, as if he'd taken on a new role no one had asked him to play. It didn't last. Fear curdled into anger, as it always did with Corinne. And within days, the humiliation she felt that afternoon turned to a resolve to rid herself of the animal entirely. She began calling auction houses, pretending it was just time to free up pasture. She arranged for a truck to come on Thursday, told the driver she'd load the bull herself. When Nathan questioned it, she told him that Granger had become unpredictable, that it was for Eliza's safety. And because Nathan was too distracted by work and bills and distance, he didn't push back. He just nodded, told her to be careful, and left again before sunrise. Corinne's plan wasn't just to sell the bull. It was to sever the last source of comfort Eliza had. To prove once and for all that nothing in that house, not love, not safety, not loyalty, would survive under her roof. The night before the pickup, she even stood by the window and watched the bull grazing under moonlight, whispering to herself how satisfying it would be to watch the girl's face when she realized he was gone. Eliza heard the truck rumbling up the road just after breakfast. It was old and loud, rattling like a tin can full of bolts. The man driving it climbed down with a clipboard and a pair of heavy gloves. Corinne stepped out to greet him with a rehearsed smile, but her voice shook when she pointed toward the bull. Granger stood at the edge of the field, his massive frame rigid, ears forward. He hadn't moved since sunrise. As if he knew, the man opened the pen gate, stepping forward slowly. He was cautious. Anyone who worked with bulls long enough learned to respect the weight of instinct. Granger didn't flinch, didn't lower his head, but his eyes tracked the man's every step. Then Eliza appeared on the porch, barefoot and motionless, her eyes wide. The man noticed her. Then he noticed how the bull shifted slightly when she came into view. "I'd be careful," the man muttered to Corinne under his breath. "He's keyed in on the girl." Corinne waved him off. But the moment the rope slipped over one of Granger's horns, everything changed. The bull didn't rear or buck. Instead, he surged forward with terrifying speed, his shoulders slamming into the man's chest. The rope snapped taut and was flung from his hands as he tumbled backward into the dirt. Corinne screamed and stumbled away, tripping over a water trough and landing hard. Granger wheeled toward her, hooves pounding the ground, dust exploding beneath him as he charged across the field. Not blindly, not wildly, but straight toward the woman who had tried to tear apart the one thing he protected. Eliza screamed, not in fear, but instinctively, a sound that broke through everything. And as Granger's massive body bore down on Corinne, he stopped. Not a foot from her. He stood there, chest heaving, eyes dark and endless, horns poised like a judge's gavel. Corinne lay flat on her back in the grass, frozen with terror, her hands scraping behind her for anything to use as a shield. But there was nothing. The driver sat up groaning from the dirt, bruised and stunned. He took one look at the bull and didn't try to approach again. From the porch, Eliza hadn't moved. She was watching Granger, and the bull was watching her. In that moment, something passed between them, not a command, not language, but something older. Granger's body lowered slightly, no longer coiled for violence. But his eyes stayed locked on Corinne. The man with the truck stood, dusting himself off and slowly backing away. "Hell no," he muttered. "I'm not hauling that bull anywhere." Corinne didn't argue. She couldn't. Her voice was stuck in her throat, strangled by shock. When Granger finally turned away and walked back across the field, every hoofstep was deliberate. The gate clanged shut behind him as he brushed it closed with his side. Corinne didn't speak for hours. The driver left without a word, dust billowing behind his truck as he sped down the long gravel road. Corinne remained sitting in the yard long after he was gone, her dress stained, hands shaking, eyes fixed on the field as if expecting the bull to come back and finish what he'd started. But Granger didn't move. He returned to his corner beneath the old cottonwood, chewing slowly, watching, patient. That night, the ranch was quieter than usual. Eliza stayed in her room, clutching the old crocheted pillow her mother had made, one of the few things Corinne hadn't thrown out. Her heart felt like it had swelled too large for her chest, like it might crack from the pressure. Granger was still here. He had stood up for her, for himself. But deep inside, she knew it wouldn't be over, because Corinne didn't let things go. She never had. And being humiliated like that, in front of a stranger by a child and an animal, would fester like a wound. Something dark was already blooming in her eyes. The next morning, the sun rose hot and harsh. The air felt brittle. Eliza woke early and went to fetch water from the pump out back. From the far side of the barn, she could see Granger lying in the dirt, blinking slowly in the warmth, swishing his tail. She smiled for the first time in weeks. Corinne didn't come down for breakfast. Eliza tiptoed inside to see if something was wrong. She wasn't in the kitchen, or the den. The back door was wide open. Eliza's eyes tracked out across the pasture. She felt it, a sick twist in her gut. And then she saw her, Corinne, creeping along the edge of the barn, clutching something in her hand. Eliza squinted. It was a bottle, small, dark. She was heading for Granger's feed bin. Eliza ran. Bare feet thudded across cracked earth. She didn't yell. She didn't want to alert Corinne. She just ran, cutting between rusted fencing and low brush, heart hammering like thunder inside her chest. By the time she reached the field, Corinne was already unscrewing the cap. The powder she poured out shimmered white in the sun like sugar. But it wasn't. Eliza had seen that bottle before. It was rat poison, kept locked under the sink, supposedly for pests in the grain shed. Labeled with a warning she couldn't read but had been told never to touch. Corinne dumped it in with the oats and stirred it with a stick, her mouth twisted in satisfaction. Granger was watching her, silent, still. But when she turned to leave, she saw Eliza standing at the fence, eyes wide, mouth open in silent horror. Corinne froze. Her face flickered between rage and calculation. She didn't say a word, just stormed across the yard, grabbing Eliza's wrist too tight, dragging her back toward the house. Inside, she slammed the door shut and locked it. Then she turned slowly, towering over the girl, face pale with fury. She didn't deny it. She didn't have to. "You should have never been born," she hissed. Eliza backed away, but Corinne followed. She shoved the child into a chair and grabbed the poker from the fireplace, holding it not raised, but as a threat. Not to strike, but to intimidate. "You say one word to your father, and that bull won't be the only thing buried under this dirt." Eliza didn't respond. She just sat there, tears brimming but unspilled, the sound of her pulse like waves in her ears. Corinne paced the room like a caged thing, mumbling to herself, the poker still in her grip. Outside, the wind began to rise. It was then they heard the creak. The gate. Corinne looked up. Her eyes narrowed. She crossed to the window, glanced out, and she went still. Granger had left the pasture. The bull was in the yard. She dropped the poker. The bull stepped closer. His hooves dug into the dry earth with deliberate pressure, cracking the soil. His body was lowered, head swaying slightly, shoulders tight with fury. Corinne screamed. Not out of fear, not yet. It was disbelief. She turned and lunged toward the gun rack in the hallway, fingers grasping at the latch. But Granger was already outside the door. His weight struck the porch like an earthquake. The door shuddered on its hinges. Eliza didn't run. She stood frozen as the shadow behind the glass thickened. The bull's breath fogged the pain. He was watching. Corinne found the rifle, loaded it with trembling hands, and swung the barrel toward the door. The front lock snapped with a crack. The door flew open. Granger's head burst through. Not wild, not uncontrolled, but with purpose. The barrel swung toward him. Eliza moved. She flung herself between them. Corinne screamed again, but it was already too late. Granger lunged. Not toward Eliza, not even toward the weapon, but straight into the living room, his massive body crushing the table, knocking over lamps and furniture, forcing Corinne backward with sheer presence. The rifle clattered across the floor, kicked beneath the couch as Corinne tripped and hit the wall. Eliza crouched low, arms over her head, but Granger passed her like she was made of air. He cornered Corinne, and stopped. She sobbed, face twisted, back against the wall. The bull towered over her, but he did not strike. He simply stood there, breathing, his nostrils flaring, his eyes unblinking, his muscles rigid with judgment. The air in the living room felt like glass, stretched, waiting to shatter. Corinne didn't move, couldn't. She was paralyzed not just by the threat of muscle and horn inches from her, but by something deeper, recognition. For the first time, she saw herself through another creature's eyes, and it broke her. Granger stared with something far more human than fury. It was judgment. He wasn't a wild beast reacting in rage. He was a guardian, a sentinel, a witness, and his patience had run dry. Eliza rose from the floor slowly, her knees scraped, her hands shaking. She walked quietly past the overturned furniture, around shattered glass and splintered wood. When she reached Granger, she placed one small hand on the thick ridge of muscle between his shoulders. He didn't move, just allowed the touch, the grounding. His breath slowed. Outside, tires crunched on gravel. Nathan had come home early. The sound of the engine idling, the truck door slamming, heavy boots crossing the yard. All of it reached the house like a distant storm rolling in. He stepped through the back door and stopped cold. His eyes swept over the wreckage, the collapsed furniture, the discarded rifle. Then his gaze landed on his daughter, on the bruises, the fear in her stance, the bull beside her, and finally on Corinne, crumpled against the wall with a face drained of all pretense. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. The truth was carved into the floorboards. He walked over to Eliza and knelt. He didn't touch her right away, just looked, really looked. Granger shifted to the side, giving the man space but not retreating. Still close, still alert. Nathan reached out, gently brushing the girl's hair back from her forehead. When she didn't flinch, he knew. And when he saw the bottle of rat poison lying on its side by the doorframe, half empty, label torn, the last thread of doubt dissolved. Corinne tried to speak, to spin a story, to accuse the animal, to deflect. Nathan didn't listen. He turned to the phone on the wall and called the sheriff. When the deputies arrived, they found Corinne restrained on the porch, ranting incoherently, insisting the child was manipulating everyone, that the bull was cursed. They took one look at Eliza, at the broken furniture, at the poison, and they didn't hesitate. She was taken into custody before sunset. Eliza said nothing through the entire process. She sat on the steps, leaning her head against Granger's side, her fingers knotted in his fur. Later that night, after the officers had gone, after Nathan had swept the glass and thrown away the ruined furniture, he sat on the floor beside his daughter. They didn't speak much, but there was a long, quiet understanding that passed between them, a reknitting of something that had been torn too long. Granger stood near the open door for most of the evening, occasionally stepping just outside to chew at the dry grass, always returning. Days passed. Eliza began to laugh again, softly at first, a sound that startled even herself. Nathan took time off from the job, stayed home, learned to cook, asked questions, and listened when she answered. He built a new fence around the pasture, stronger, taller, not to keep Granger in but to keep others out. People in town talked, they always did, about the girl and the bull and the woman who'd lost her mind. But no one ever came close enough to test what happened on that land again. Months later, on a still autumn morning, Eliza sat beneath the cottonwood tree in the pasture, her feet tucked beneath her, a book in her lap, her head resting against Granger's flank. The bull lay beside her, eyes half shut, breathing slow and steady. The sun warmed the field in soft golden waves. Wind tugged gently at the hem of her dress. Somewhere beyond the trees, distant birds called to each other, but the hollow was silent, peaceful. Eliza closed her eyes. She remembered every moment. The fear, the cold floors, the silence she used to think was normal, but it no longer sat heavy on her chest. It was like old smoke, something that had passed through, but no longer clung to her skin. Beside her, Granger let out a slow breath. She reached over, pressed her hand to the wide plane of his side, and whispered something too low for the wind to carry. He twitched an ear, adjusted his bulk slightly, and leaned into her hand. And in that moment, under the branches of that old cottonwood, Eliza Marin, once the forgotten child, once the voiceless one, was no longer alone. She never would be again.